outside of therapy, not to eliminate or not to neglect its immense value. But there's so many fields that are available to people in using these ideas. And so when I say a new way of thinking about human behavior, I'm thinking about this immense growth of understanding that goes beyond what I think even Dr. Bowen had hoped, and he laid the groundwork for. So let's see how this goes. Okay. Here, I'm so grateful for Dr. Kerr for putting together the immense connections where Bowen connected behavior and to biology and evolution in ways that I don't think anyone had done as carefully or as completely. He did it with the clinical research with his families, but then he extended it to this interconnectedness in all of life. And one of the first people that I heard at the Bowen Center, one of the scientists, was talking about social systems in humans and others with Dr. Calhoun, whose work still inspires me. And then Dr. Bowen was including people like Dr. Paul McLean, who was a real forward thinker in the world of neuroscience. And so this has grown. And now, in another generation, we have Dr. Panksepp in this same line of thinking that's been wonderful as opening up ideas. Now, I just thought, if the door's wide open, where would you go with your thinking? And I will be really interested in hearing what you would be thinking about if you could take these ideas and think about human functioning. Economic systems, education, health, community, where would you go? Nature and human life in the balance, spiritual development, neurophysiology, medication. I just was playing with the ideas. But I thought what I'd like to do today is just present one person's journey with this theory, just a few pieces of it, that I can do. One, obviously, has to begin, I think, with the ideas of differentiation of self and the puzzles that this offered, both its basis for all other thinking, I think, about human systems and the challenges that it offers. So I got curious, and I'll talk more about what my curiosity led me to, because Dr. Bowen talked about it as a naturally occurring process. So how could I see it better? And then I was curious about who can use Bowen theory. Is it, there was this sort of conventional wisdom that Bowen theory is for highly educated, middle-class people who don't have to deal with some of the other challenges of life and can use these ideas. Almost like you have the free time and the freedom to do it. Well, there's some truth to that. But I was curious about people who could go beyond that. And some of these things led me, with some of my curiosity about some of the concepts, and my life, to study migration. I'll go more into that. And in that process, learning more about the societal process as well. So here goes the beginning of this. I'm going to have to take some of these things slowly. Really, the idea that differentiation of self, is it a new discovery? In some ways, Bowen said no. He gave it a name that fit science, which is extremely useful. But he did suggest it was a naturally occurring process built into human nature. So I think Bowen theory helps understand, and I think Dr. Kerr laid a beautiful, beautiful picture of this, what alters this naturally occurring process. So I was looking for examples of higher levels of differentiation that occurred naturally. And I discovered some of these in the lives of some mystics, not for their mystical experiences so much as for the way they engaged their lives in the world. So I thought there were three examples of modern mystics where I would say they would not have been known so much as mystics, but for the influence that they had in the world and for the way they lived. And I stayed with the more modern ones because, for today, just to think briefly about this, because they had a really good documentation of their lives that you could study and see. Some of you may not know who John Woolman is. I think there's one person here, I do believe, was a profoundly influential man in the early 17th century in New England, having slavery in New England come to an end. Doc Hammarskjöld, I think most people would know, and his book called Markings, which documents some of his journey. And Dorothy Sohle, I don't know how many people would know who she is. She was a post-Holocaust theologian in Germany who took on the challenges that that world offered. What I thought was so interesting in their examples is I was trying to understand differentiation in this. What I thought was so interesting was that this process that they engaged was very much like the process that Dr. Kerr described, but it was a process of differentiation going on through the lifetime, as I could see it, moving more and more to their consistent, living their lives with consistent principles, and always overcoming this force to go along. And it's very evident in some of their reflections on what it was like. Their turning points in life are also clearly defined. And I think those are evident for most every adult who tries to live a more consistent life. And then they were often clear how they were available in relationships, and they were open in their relationships, but their family and themselves and self was seen in this larger sense of family and society, of community and society. What I got from this was these sort of take-home lessons that are going to stay with me, and I'm going to keep investigating. But this process of differentiation does, in fact, occur naturally in many situations. I think they're extremely useful to learn. But that Bowen's 8 concepts really offer for me a clear view of what makes the difference or what gets in the way of this process. And so I think the lessons are everywhere. So I'm taking them where they take me in some sense. One of the interesting pieces for me then is who can use Bowen theory? And this idea that it is limited to, maybe the people in this room, something like that. That is just, it just didn't make sense to me. So I had an opportunity when my husband agreed graciously, just didn't stay long enough, that we could move to El Paso for about 5 years for me to investigate what was interesting to me, which I'll talk about a little bit more about emotional cutoff and migration. I had an opportunity presented to me by the people that I knew who were curious about what are you doing here? Why are you talking about these things? And we went to a couple of churches, one in El Paso, one in Juarez, and got to know people who were curious, but they had neither education nor the advantages of financial security, but they did know how to think. And the picture that on the left is a group of women that I got to know fairly well over a period of time in the central Santa Catalina. That is the women's cooperative programs that Ms. Trillo has also spent a great deal of time, much more in that than I know. But it was fascinating to see that these women could put the concept of differentiation, as they understood it, at the core of their lives. And the woman on the right talked to me in great detail about her, they developed programs that got developed to allow them to increase their education, as well as including education and family, including a co-op where they could earn money. It has made a huge difference in their lives. And this woman was saying she would like to, she wanted to learn to read so badly. And she said she struggled, and she watched her children develop and grow and learn to read and all, and she was eager to learn, and she simply couldn't. And she said, I finally talked to God, and God said, just be content with the wisdom you got. And so she went on with life with a lot of wisdom and could study Bowen theory, but didn't need to be able to read. And that is I think one of the big pieces that is still to be learned. What does it take to teach Bowen theory, to present Bowen theory, and to offer it in a different way that many different people can use in different settings? Dr. Kerr's had a chance to move into other cultures with it, but I think this is an interesting, and I think Ms. Trito's been one, and I think other people will be doing things to show how it works in a different setting. But I needed to cut this down, so I had to move on to the areas that have kept me really busy for the last 15 or 20 years. And these two concepts were the last two that Dr. Bowen put into his theory: emotional cutoff and societal emotional process. And emotional cutoff was the first thing that grabbed me because it was something that lived in my life, in my family, and had consequences that I didn't like too much. But I wanted to understand it more. And so these questions came to me, like knowing emotional cutoff, and those of you who haven't studied much of theory, my shorthand for this is when young adults disconnect from family relationships rather than resolve the family relationships. And that can go on then for generations, and I was the product of several generations of that. So I was curious about what are the conditions of life that precede this cutoff? What's managed by emotional cutoff? What shifts in the family following emotional cutoff? And what happens in succeeding generations? Now today, I don't have the answers. I have more of the questions and the ways I've struggled with it, but I decided to take this into the laboratory of life in migration. At first, I was sort of equating emotional cutoff and migration. Boy, I've learned a lot since then, that it is not that simple. Like no other, and how could you expect something so huge to be related only on one concept? So what I had a chance to do, first thing I had a chance to do in El Paso in '95, I guess, was to interview about 40 women in a prenatal clinic to learn a little bit about what they were experiencing as they were migrants, recent migrants. The clinic was just over the bridge from Juarez to El Paso. And they were just beginning a new life at the same time, having a baby. And there was a lot of data available, health data on it. And I had a chance to do interviews. So I put together a real simple interview form to try and understand about their connections. What were the connections? And I devised in my head this little proxy for emotional cutoff, which I think was reasonably accurate. And it had to do with how much information did these women have about the families that they were part of. And I asked them about their mothers and their fathers and their maternal grandparents, paternal grandparents, simple things like occupation, birth date, birthplace, death date, death place, sibling position. And there was this huge range of people who knew practically nothing in this and those who knew just about everything. So I was able to take that and score that and take those extremes, because there were some extremes, of 12 women in one extreme that had little information, 12 women in another extreme, and continued to use this as sort of a proxy for emotional cutoff. And then try to correlate the facts of functioning that were evident in the clinic. Whether the pregnancy was planned, contact with the partner, not information in contact with the family, and then the complications in the pregnancy or with the infant. So quickly, this is an unfinished study for reasons I can tell you, and will have to be repeated because it wasn't able to follow these people after the study. But in the people with low or incomplete family data, there had very few pregnancy complications. They were very mild. I noted of those 12 women, 16, and we know things like small amount of albumin in the urine, small blood pressure rise, things like that. Only 3 out of those 12 had planned the pregnancy. Only 3 out of the 12 were married. 10 out of the 12 had grown up with their parents separated, so they were not from a really intact family. And 12 out of 12 had successful births. That's an interesting piece. On the side that had more accurate family data, the pregnancy complications were sort of double. They were still very mild with the exception of one early miscarriage. 8 out of those 12 women had planned the pregnancy. 11 of the 12 were married. Out of that, only 5 of them had lived in a family with families separated, so they were more from intact families. And all of them had contact with the partner, father of the baby. And 11 of the 12 had successful births. So trying to understand this a little bit, I got to know about the Mexican paradox. Some of you may know about this. That there is, Mexican American women have unusual success in pregnancy and birth. Never mind the amount of medical care, any other factors, they do exceedingly well. But in that group of cutoff women, the baby was the fulfillment for these women. And the only contact that woman had in her family primarily was her own mom. And I was looking then at the factors that indicated stability in these families and instability. I was sort of partly predicting the future, but the contact with the husband or the partner or the spouse and the knowledge about the family, I thought, predicted some future stability, probably. I was curious about the higher complications. They weren't significant, but I noted, I mean, certainly statistically they are. They weren't huge. But I did notice that among those women, they experienced the pregnancy as more stressful, missing their connections to their family unit. And I thought that was probably pretty significant. I was unable to follow up with this group. It was an unfunded study. It was my volunteer time. And the women had dispersed because they were moving into the rest of the community, and I was not able to follow them. So, you know, work for the future, who knows? But I was curious about, I wanted to know a little bit more about the long-term results of cutoff. So I went back to this family from Germany. Great-grandmother there on the left. There is an interesting study, I mean many interesting studies about the health of migration, that primarily new migrants are healthier than the general population in the U.S. And that lasts for maybe a generation. But after the second or third generation, the health deteriorates to be at least equal to our general population, which I think is, I suspect, is related to cutoff. As I look at the symptoms that cutoff can generate, and the inability to have the flexibility in relationships as time goes on, as generations go on. So I thought I would follow up with more of a careful history with my clinical cases, because I was seeing quite a few people at the border who did have access to information that preceded their family's cutoff from Mexico. And they could give a lot of facts about the family process at the point they left the home territory. And then they had ongoing efforts to stay in connection to those families. And to stay, eventually connect to the extended family that was still in Mexico, if they hadn't already. And I'm going to just summarize this quickly because it's too complicated, but what basically the facts showed is that the branches of the cutoff families had far more symptoms and functioned less well than the branches who had stayed in the home territory when people were able to be in contact. That was not universal. In the people that cut off, there was often 1 out of 10 or so that was functioning quite well. But in general, there was this very, very powerful thing that in the cutoff branches, people were struggling more. You know, those who stayed in Durango and other parts of Mexico, when they were able to be in contact, they could see those branches doing well and improving their functioning over time, because at least economically and educationally. So, still curious about the exceptions. But I got to thinking about when do people leave and trying to study a little bit more about what was known. And when do people leave? Do they leave under stress of economic stress, not enough space, not enough land? Is it emotional process? Are there environmental, political conditions? And opportunities to greatly improve their life situations, all of those. It's no longer very easy to outline one. It's important for me to be able to see the many, many factors involved. So I was able to see a little bit of a new view of migration. Here's a group on the left who, from an indigenous group, the Rauseo tribe, who large numbers have settled in Juarez, and they have built their own church and stay in contact with their family history, and I think as a group have done pretty well. They left under stress of I think, land and economic stress. And you know, some of their spaces look a lot like, this isn't exactly their home, but look a lot like that. They have adapted. It hasn't been easy. But in looking at the literature, we talk about who leaves. And it's not clear. Dr. Calhoun's research says that we must migrate emotionally, intellectually, or physically to survive. And he was looking at his study of rats, and he was looking at humans over history. Often, the younger or less powerful members of a tribe or family leave, and primogeniture was really strong in Europe and some places in the United States, so that one oldest male usually got the land, and others had to move on. There's also losers in the triangle process, and in the literature of animals, they're extruded. And that's fairly accurate in some families, I think, that someone can be extruded from the family. And then there are those places where a whole family or group are in danger, and survival of those who can may mean migration. So this represents the woman on the left of emotional triangles, that their land had become somewhat less productive, and her parents died, and she had two brothers who said, "You have no men, you're out of here. You can't have any place here." She left alone at 18 and moved to the border and has survived fairly well. It was not easy. The other represents a period in which there was severe drought requiring large groups to leave, and the difficulty that can involve. And the impact on families is not altogether clear. If it's just for if families leave because of the environmental conditions, or if they leave because of the emotional conditions. I have my suspicions, but I still don't have all the information I'd like. So it is clear to me that many of these things, the societal disruption, environmental, and family process, all go together as people leave and try to start a new life. And most of us are products of that in one way or another. So it is, I think, an intersection. The thing that this has taken me to now is that this is an intersection of emotional process in the family and in society. It's clearer at times when there's a lot of political issues involved at the societal process. So it's a response to both social challenges, the societal challenges, and opportunities. And there's one evolutionary biologist who has an interesting comment on this. As an evolutionary imperative, she says, this is Bobby Love, from an evolutionary perspective, all the meanings of migration reflect ecological influences of better or worse conditions for individual survival and reproduction. And again, we are probably products of that. So some of it, I have been interested in the generational studies. Catherine Baker has an article in Family Systems, it's online bibliography, looking at this situation in Russia. But there's a lot to be done to understand the impact on families today. In the meantime, guess who else is struggling with the environmental conditions? We hear about it. The most successful other primates dealing with this are the baboons. And they have had, since the 1960s, an immense amount of challenge environmentally and probably politically in Kenya, in the Amboseli Reserve. But they have done an amazing job of migration, flexibly adapting their lives to this new environment, to new social realities, environmental realities. So, are we going to do as well? I don't know. One of the things that has been challenging to me is to look at, and especially in El Paso, as global warming tightens the availability of water. Jeffrey Sachs says, prepare for a torrent of forced migrations. This was in 2005. It has been happening ever since. He called them climate refugees, I think. Most recently, in 2010, Princeton has put together a very interesting study talking about how shifts in the global climate might affect human migration from one region to another, and they come up with a rather alarming statistic that, as I read more deeply, it's got a lot of variables that can influence it, and I think it's important to know that. What could influence this? but a wave of up to 6.7 million migrants from Mexico could head to the U.S. to escape the ravages of climate change on crops. When I got into the details, they're talking about over 50 years, but they're also talking about periods in which there would be forced mass migrations. So this brings me to the questions that I think have occupied me most recently, and I'll do a real quick version of this, where the seems to me that migration, it can show us, let me just go to this one. The worldwide emotional process and family process can be seen in these big moves in migration. It's grounded in biology and connection to the earth, and we are an organism, like others, aware of impending threat, and have with that this chronic anxiety. So I think about chronic anxiety fueling regression in family and larger groups, and living near and friends in Ciudad Juarez, dealing with what probably is evidence of what we're all in, which is a regression in society. So my last piece is to see what do we learn from societal regression, working from current knowledge, using Bowen's concepts on emotional process, his 8th concept especially, and bringing together a cross-section of disciplines, which we've started to do in El Paso some and would like to do elsewhere, for ongoing dialogue. And the first piece we tried was last February, with using natural systems to study the roots of violence and the roots of cooperation. It is exciting. And so I will end with the fact that out of these groups have been some ideas. This slide I will erase for a minute, but constructive action is possible. And so here's some ideas people came up with. But working toward a more differentiated self. This is back to the beginning, where it all begins, is taking on responsibility for my own functioning, being present and accounted for everywhere, across the groups. And we may represent, I don't know, you think, how many groups are you a part of? What if you are your best functioning self represented in those groups? Pretty good ripple effect, if that's true. And back to this new knowledge, that natural systems helps integrate new knowledge, I think. I think systems thinking integrates new knowledge and information that can cross broadly across various groups, various small groups. Again, a ripple effect. We have no idea what it can mean. And there's a favorite concept of Dr. Calhoun's that I love, and it is creating conceptual space. And as I think about it, it means with new knowledge, we make space with ideas for an expanding population to be more effective. There's more places for our knowledge and our interests to go if we have new information and a new way of using it with systems thinking. And another of Calhoun's ideas, that as his demonstration on density with rats and mice, showed that if they could learn cooperation, they could manage the density differently. So engaging more tools for managing this increased density and stress, with cooperation being one. And then I think toning down the physiology of stress, or managing the physiology of stress, looks like one of the other main pieces that people can do to keep the creative thinking available. So, what's the point? Okay, big, quick run through. There's this huge world to study. And Bowen theory of natural systems offer tools, I think. So working toward greater differentiation, I think, provides new opportunities for ideas to cross disciplines without getting in each other's way. Individual creativity, I think, leaves room for others. So I say go for it. And tell me what you decide you're going to do, and let's meet here. I'd love to know where it takes you. So that's it. Thank you.
Let me invite Ms. Rauseo to the table.
Test. There it comes.
Oh.
Well, I'll start since give you
Get a rest.
give you a rest, yeah. So I just had a series of thoughts that I wrote down as you presented things in a thought-provoking way. This issue of bullet theory is for the highly educated upper middle class. It's one that he heard, we've all heard. I hear it less than I used to. I don't know about the rest of you. But back in 1980, after making a number of trips to Pittsburgh to do conferences, and many of the people in Pittsburgh coming to Washington to hear about, they got fed up with these tapes he would bring of well-educated, at least upper middle or if not middle class families, articulate. Let's find a family that Bowen can't interview. They didn't tell me what ahead of time. So they found a family, working class. I think they may have been on welfare for a while. Their baby had been taken away from them, and they, had a family history on each side of some fragmentation, things you tend to associate with families that are doing less well. And by the time the interview was over, they were talking in ways that were identical to all the other tapes he brought to Pittsburgh. And the people said, "How did you do that?" But I thought it was thought-provoking in the sense that if you're thinking theory, you would ask good questions. These are universals, and people will talk about it. And that question often comes up. I've had it come up in meetings. I did a few consultations at a place in Pittsburgh. This is not unique to Pittsburgh, but they were dealing with a lot of welfare, fragmented, difficult, low-income families. So I brought in bullet theory, brought in my tapes. We're tired of hearing about this middle to upper class intellectual. We don't deal with such people. And so they brought in a family for me to interview. I said I would do that. And what was interesting about it, to me, what helped me think this through, is that the woman in the interview was able to describe very, very well how triangles work, just by asking questions about it, and laid it out as well as anybody I know. In her case, though she was pretty stuck in who was causing the triangle to be what it is, and she thought her ex-husband was the cause of the problem. But of course, that's not different for anybody. We all face that in trying to look at triangles, how to get beyond cause and effect. I think it was a useful interview because that clearly wasn't income related or socioeconomically related, but had more to do with emotionality. The study of mystics, I think, you didn't go into that, but I think much, but I thought that was just a very interesting area, and I think you and I have discussed this some in the past, and it gave me a somewhat different idea about it as I was listening. I think myself, the safest or most solid definition of what it means to be a self is how people function in the most intimate and involved emotional relationships, and I know you would agree with that. That's where people have the most difficulty maintaining self, in the relationships where they're most invested emotionally in what's happening and most affected emotionally. And then people can be outside the family and function, as we all know, on a higher level in the, say, the work world and professional world. And what do you call that? I know this medical resident I referenced earlier. At the hospital, she's confident, decisive, and effective, very bright. In her personal life, she's the exact mirror opposite. And she says, how come? And how to think about that. I mean, one way we have of talking about that is that her functional level is higher in the workplace than it is in family arena, and that reflects a different basic level being not that high, which I think is accurate. Then you get people who are unusual in taking on very difficult societal situations, as you were saying, able to maintain self against a lot of opposition in societal issues. And so maybe it's just a matter of degree. I don't know, that if you think of people having a certain level of self, and I'm just opening this for discussion, and it waters down very quickly in the intimate personal situation, but they do somewhat better in the outside situation, function with more self. But there are people at one end of the spectrum who can't succeed in any context, that really become wholly dependent on society. Anyway, it just got me thinking about how to conceptualize this difference between functional level and basic level, and how to apply that to people like Gandhi or Hammarskjöld or whomever. I think the survey of the immigrant females, I think that kind of a study is really elegant in the sense that it actually shows something. But I liked your phrase, you used that questionnaire as a proxy. I thought that was an interesting choice of words for cutoff. Because I think that has implications for a lot of research. That people will construct a scale of emotional cutoff or a scale of differentiation, give this to people, and then assume that they're actually measuring emotional cutoff or differentiation. Particularly if they get a finding that predicts what it's supposed to happen. But as I look at these scales, there's a big gap between what's necessarily being asked in these questionnaires and what we know about the concept, even though at times it may be predictive, which I think is fine. But I like the use of the word proxy, because you're just showing an association. Right? These are how these people at this end of the spectrum answered the questions. Here's how these people at the other end. That's factual. This is the way they answered the questions. And this is predictive, at least in this small study, of the following things. And here's my effort to deal with exceptions. And to me, that's solid. But you don't know for sure if you're dealing with cutoff or not. Right? But that's fine, because it's such a complex idea. It's hard to reduce to a questionnaire. But I just like that. I hadn't heard you present that before for some reason. Anyway, the baby is fulfilled. I like this. This, I think, again, related to that study, you're theorizing or hypothesizing that a person who is missing their family when they may get pregnant, if I heard you right, may be actually under more stress than a person who doesn't even think about their family, and they're invested in the future with this baby, and that's going to stabilize them.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting hypothesis. It shows how difficult this kind of thing is to study. What's going on in the head psychologically? How is something perceived or as a threat or not? And in one case, the absence of family is perceived as a threat, but that turned out maybe to be a positive. You don't know for sure. Whereas the absence of family is seen as a good thing. I can just look to the future to solve my life problems. Two other points, I think. This issue of migrants in the first generation doing well, and then health declining in the second or third. I think you're saying essentially the same thing, but little I've seen of that is that first generation migrants really seem to place a premium on taking advantage of absolutely every opportunity and pull up their functioning relationship. And I would think that would promote health, but then there's often a lot of child focus that we're doing this for you. So in the next generation, you're going to be able to, do even better. Whether that figures into it as well, it is related, I think, to cutoff. But I don't know if I said that very clearly. That was one idea. And then we went to see the new exhibit, the Human Origins exhibit at the Smithsonian. My wife and I went down there during the Christmas break. Evolution, Human Evolution. It's a terrific exhibit, and then to the think tank at the National Zoo. But I hadn't been aware so much of the idea that fluctuations in climate, dramatic fluctuations like occurred with the Ice Age, et cetera, may play a role in accelerating evolution. It's one idea about how the brain got so big that humans had to adapt to a wide, changing climates over time, in addition to this other idea of having to deal with more complex social systems. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting, how climate change context can relate to evolutionary change. And this lastly, just the whole societal regression idea remains extremely difficult. To me, it's like individuality and togetherness. I mean, you look at the deal that we're in society these days, you look at the Congress, and you look at the polarizations, and people say, oh, it's always been that way. Is this what Bowen called an emotional regression at the societal level? I have no doubt that that's true, but many people say, no, that's BS. It's always, people are always saying that, lamenting for the good old days, when the good old days weren't necessarily so good. So I think it's always good to punch it up, the importance of that idea. So I'll leave it with that.
Well, I think I'm still wired, right? Still, okay. I don't know, I'm going to throw out a couple of things and ask if maybe Dr. Kerr will want to enlarge on them now, maybe with your questions, I'm not sure. But one of the things he described so beautifully is this business about what do you think of me, do you accept me, what do you want me to do, that piece, and the difference in how people are responsive or less responsive to it. I was wondering, and I think maybe tomorrow we'll illustrate this a little more, about how to describe how subtle that is, because it is maybe a facial expression, it is maybe the way somebody walks into the room, it may be far more subtle than that even, that these automatic responses are taking place. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because I think Dr. Kerr knows it about as well as anybody. And it's like, in a fusion, how...
I'm not sensitive.
Well, actually, combat. So we'll see if that's, to hear more about that. And the other thing I thought maybe relates to this late night thinking that he was having, I'm not sure, but it's the flow where emotion and thinking are available, but stress changes, how that is available. The thing I was wondering about, and how it when all of a sudden stress gets it pretty stuck, that both emotion and thinking are not available, and the emotion takes over and you're stuck. I'm wondering how the challenge of seeking, how the challenge of new ideas and all helps regulate emotion. It's sort of the flip side. And it just got me thinking when you presented that both times. And then I have one long-term question that I haven't had answered. That is, I believe the idea of parental over-involvement is most visible with with chronic anxiety. That it's the anxiety that drives the parental over-involvement. Maybe it's flip side of that, but that's my question, how to think about that. Because it seems to me that parental over-involvement can take, you said, can be somebody's appears to be neglectful, but they're already so connected. But I'm thinking it's the anxiety that fuels both ends of that. And wonder where you're at. Okay. So.
Shall I respond very briefly? Just, well, I think tomorrow's tape describes as well as anything that I have in the way of tapes, that all the tapes do in a way, but the subtle nature of reactivity and the things we were talking about earlier. So I'll just leave that for tomorrow. And the impact of, I wrote down the impact of stress, emotion, and thinking. How do you get out of that? And the possibility that can thinking get you out of stress. Dan Papero was presenting the other night at our Thursday professional meeting, and he quoted something each of you may know something about, because I think it's an idea that came from John Allman, a neuroscientist. And in the brain, there's one area I think involves the cingulate gyrus, but then there are other areas, surely the amygdala and maybe even a third area, where, according to Allman, it's almost like there's a switch in the brain that you can go from anxiety to problem solving, and that they are reciprocally interrelated. And I think it's supported by people who will say they're obsessed, they're caught in an obsessive loop in their heads about how bad they are, whatever it is, and they say, if only something could distract me, if I could only get interested in something, maybe I can break that loop. And I think people do break that loop that way. That there is, if it can shift to problem solving, that there's some kind of interconnection between anxiety and problem solving in the brain. And I think, like a person I consulted with a day or two ago, she said it's been a very anxious couple of weeks. I hope our discussion today can be helpful to me in toning down my anxiety. And this is something people hear all the time. They say, oh my God, how am I going to do that? You can tell them, just look, calm down, just kind of calm down. But in the course of the discussion, we just stayed on theory and came up with a little idea. I think I mentioned briefly earlier about that how do you, when you're talking to somebody else in an anxious way about your anxieties, how do you do it in a way that doesn't put so much pressure on the other to respond or trigger the other desire to retreat? Because I think we all benefit from talking about things we're anxious about to others. But you got this with a twist, always can get the other reactive. And what I came up with in that one is, how do you talk about anxiety in a way that's interesting to the other person? Of course, that requires a certain level of detachment from your anxiety, perhaps. But then the other side is the reciprocity. The people in the world who tend to endure listening to other people talk about their anxiety and vent and take a kind of one-up position. They don't like it, but where I refer to them as patient listeners, enduring it, rather than finding what the other has to say interesting. And what's it take to do that? And it turns out, she said, that's exactly what's going on between me and my boyfriend. And I feel so diminished. And anyway, she took that idea and ran with it. And I think that probably will help her calm down. And I was able to skillfully avoid saying, just calm down. But I agree totally that over-involvement is fueled by anxiety. Anxiety is fueled by the undifferentiation coupled with the stresses on the system. One of the best examples of that, I think, is that I've seen in nature is the rhesus macaques down at Cayo Santiago off Puerto Rico that were brought there to be studied on a small island. You know about this. And then they watched Steve Sumi, not Steve Sumi, it was another person who made this observation, but populations tend to go up and down there because they remove monkeys after a while, so it won't be overpopulated. So there are periods when it's very low, and there are periods when it's very high. And when it's very low, the mother-offspring interactions are very different than when it's very high. When it's very low, when it's very high, they're overprotective and act more fearful and get more focused on offspring. It won't permit the offspring to leave the family group very much without pulling them back. Whereas when the population is much less, the kids get a lot more freedom to explore. And that seemed a perfect metaphor of sorts, or comparison for what's going on in human society. There's so much anxious protectiveness and fear that it drives families, I think, more and more into that mode. And of course, the more you get into that mode, the more you generate anxiety and depressants.
We've got about 35 minutes for further discussion, thinking, questions. If anybody would like to take the mic, please turn on the mic in the audience. Thanks.
Very challenged.
So are we all, especially with the technology. You got it.
Two things. The thing you just talked about, when I was in the postgraduate program, I love this, the comment or statement, take a research stance. That's been very useful for me, either as a listener or when I'm in the middle of my own jump. Just take the research stance. Gets me in a very neutral position. But I'm talking about the middle classness of Bowen. Since Gene and I retired and moved down to Appalachia in Southwest Virginia, I have a pro bono practice there, working with the totally unempowered poor who have no access to anything. And it has been a really wonderful experience working with these people because they get Bowen. They're poor, but they are not Bowen, and they get Bowen theory. They especially can tap into the generational information wonderfully. And because I have this wonderful interest, I mean, I really grabbed hold of the alphas in families and have tried to do my own little research around that. And I don't have a lot of reading material, but I'm doing my own stuff with it. And I've got a women's group that I work with on that. Has also been very helpful because people who come to therapy are usually leaders in the family, and that's a very appealing concept for them. And the Bowen is theory works with these people. It's been very, very good for me. It's been wonderful for me. So thank you for that.
One thought on that is, I've found that there are sometimes people who have less to unlearn in these populations than some of the populations that come out of
That's very
as
true.
graduates of their schools.
They're very open to new information, and they've grabbed this, and it's just been wonderful. Thank you.
Ms. Britton, I hope you'll write about that one too.
Just to follow up, partly related to Louise's comment to your question, just about, I was thinking about the problem people have sometimes with these videotapes. When people have done videotapes and the interviews have been well done by the interviewer, first-time interviews often with families that are really struggling. They're probably some of the best educational tapes we have, because people, what I wrote down here is people can describe with good questions how they're living Bowen theory. Whereas as people get involved with it over time, they tend to say more about how they're thinking about their situations. And it's relevant to how it's often heard as just intellectualization. And people have a harder time, I think, realizing how this way of thinking actually translates into a different way of being. But seeing families that are struggling with it, with good questions, who can articulate it, I think is a really valuable thing, not only for your own learning, but for education.